So here's how it works. When you alter an ecosystem, okay, and let's say we burned a forest or cut down a forest, all right, what starts first are always the annual weeds or perennial weeds and grasses. Okay, these two stages kind of go together, all right, in what I call the herbaceous stage. Herbaceous stage. And what that means is herbaceous means green plants. So it all starts with green plants. Okay, just regular green plants like grasses and weeds and stuff like that. So if we had a catastrophic fire and you have just bare ground, the soil is still there. Okay, so you don't have to start from scratch with absolutely nothing. You already have a foundation to start your ecosystem with. You call it secondary succession. All right, and you start with the herbaceous stage. And then what happens is the herbaceous stage creates a good environment, all right, for shrubs and small trees to come in. Okay? And when that happens, when you get the shrubs and the trees, usually these are pine trees around here. So if you see an ecosystem that around here that has a lot of small pine trees, okay, you might see some other small shrubs, all right, you know it has undergone through this first stage of succession into the second stage of succession. The herbaceous stage will last about 5 years. So if any field that you see when you drive home, even though it's been left alone, if it's still just all grasses and weeds, it's less than 5 years since it was disturbed somehow. If it goes into the second stage where you start getting a few shrubs and stuff like that, okay, you start developing the shrubs and trees. Now you're talking somewhere approximately, for us around here I'm talking about, between 5 and 15 years of age. All right, and we give this a name also. All right, I always like to call it the pioneer stage, and you'll see why in a second. Oops, pioneer stage. Because in this particular point, at this point of succession, pioneer trees start coming in. Okay, pioneer trees are the trees that will come in first and establish the right conditions for the next stage of succession. All right, so for us it'll be pine trees. There's sassafras trees. There are some good dogwoods and some of the smaller trees, some maples. Okay, but for us it's mostly a pine forest, and so what you'll see is kind of a pine cedar forest start growing. And I usually call it the pioneer stage, if you want to call it that, young forest stage. And you'll see the trees, any trees or shrubs, you're going to be a lot of shrubs, going to be really thick. The trees will only be 10, 15 feet tall. All right, and we're talking anywhere from 5 to 15 years old. So if you see an ecosystem like that, then you know it's stage. Okay? Then we get into the stage where you actually develop a forest. All right. Now here it's called the young pine forest. I wouldn't necessarily call it that, but it's perfectly fine. All right, where you start having those shrubs disappear, the grasses and stuff disappear, and what you're starting to create is a canopy, which means you have trees growing up higher above, and you create this canopy right up here, which then begins to block the light at the lower levels of your forest, which means then most of the trees and shrubs die out because they can't get enough sun. And what that does is it now sets the stage for shade-tolerant seedlings to start growing. And you'll never guess who those are. Those shade-tolerant seedlings are what you're going to have in your final forest. These are what we call the climax forest. All right, these are what we call the mature forest. Okay, so we start with like a young forest, and we're talking in this stage, it's the longest stage, I guess if you want to call it that, anywhere from 15 to probably for us as much as 80 to 100 years, if you want to think of it that way. I'm going to give it a broad 80 years, somewhere around there. And it all depends, you can tell by the size of the trees. Okay? Now, once you get through the young pine forest, you hit the mature forest right here. All right, or the oak hickory forest for us. All right, it's oak and hickory. So that's really what you're looking at for us here. It's oak and hickory. Now they call it a mature forest. Sometimes I will call this a mature forest over here, or a young forest. It all depends on how old it is. If it's around 80 years old, I start saying, oh, that's a mature forest. All right, but the real dividing line here are all of these oak and hickories that are growing up real tall here, okay, started out as young little seedlings here. And that's how you know. You will see oak and hickory trees down here starting to grow. And then once you get to the next stage, they take over your canopy. So now your canopy, instead of being pine trees, and by the way, the other one here would be, I should put this down, I apologize. It's pine and ash for us around here. So you have a dominant tree cover of pine and ash. Eventually the pines die out, the ash take over. Then the oak and hickory trees start growing down here. And unfortunately for the pine and ash, they make a perfect situation for these little tiny seedlings to grow into great big trees, which then kill off the pine and ash. That's the odd thing about succession, is one stage sets the conditions just right for the second stage, which sets the conditions just right for the next stage. So basically each stage is kind of committing suicide, because they create this next stage, and that next stage then destroys them. So it's kind of a sad situation for the lower stages, but once you hit the mature oak hickory forest, it will stay like that for a long time. So we're talking anywhere from 80 to 100 years plus, meaning that it will stay an oak hickory forest until the next disruption occurs. Okay? Do you get that? And if you don't, let's try another situation, another one real quick here, just to give you a hand. All right, here we go. Now we're going to look at the same thing again, okay, this time in a different diagram and probably a different location, but it'll give you some perspective. There are no definite boundaries between the stages. All right, just try to understand the whole entire process. So over here, you're going to start off with secondary succession because you had a forest fire. Okay, so now what you have is grasses, some weeds and stuff like that start to grow. Okay, and then you'll start seeing grasses called perennials come in. Perennials are grasses that grow every single year. Then the pioneer trees and shrubs and stuff start coming in, and you start seeing them growing higher and bigger. Notice how you go from just a real low grassy area now to a greater taller stage. Okay, in this particular case, because it's a slightly different area than us, it's going to take a little bit longer, and they're saying it goes up to 150 years, but that's okay. Where then you go into your pine tree stage right here, where you start creating a canopy. Pine trees then would be taken over by, for our case, would be ash. All right, and work their way over to the end with oak and hickory. Okay, so it's succession is the way nature changes to come up with the final biome. All right, but we're not done with that yet, because there's primary succession. All right, so it's almost the same, except we have to go backwards a little bit further. It's not as common. So if we would draw a line right here, this all we've already covered. Okay, that's the same thing we just covered. That's secondary succession. That's the same process. Everything's the same. Nothing new and different. The only difference is what happens before this, because now you're starting with just an area of rock, exposed rock. So what you need to do is somehow create soil so that the rest of the process can continue. And how that works is in the cracks of rocks, water will get in, okay? And then in the wintertime, that water will expand, make the cracks bigger. The cracks that are bigger start collecting organic material. That organic material decomposes, and you start getting soil in there. At the same time, you get lichens and mosses that start growing in those cracks, and you see this a lot in the rocks and stuff. And then they slowly, over a long period of time, start to create soil in which your annual grasses can grow, your weeds and stuff like that, so that you can continue with the process of succession. So primary succession starts from brand new, newly exposed rock. Okay, and continue. So when we talk about our area, we're talking about secondary succession taking about 100 years or so. But primary succession, because this initial process takes so long, everything over here takes so long, you probably have to double or triple the time that the entire process takes place. Okay? Now, you've also seen this before. There's many examples of primary succession, which I think are great to point out. Okay? Here are some pictures where primary succession can occur. All right, over here, you got a sand dune, okay, where you start off with just bare sand, and then you can start going through primary succession, and what you're most familiar with are the beach grasses and stuff like that that grow. That's just the beginning of succession. Now, the problem with sand dunes in New Jersey and along the East Coast is that the weather constantly breaks them apart. Okay, they're constantly being moved, therefore they're constantly starting over again. So you never quite get past that grass stage unless you move inland just a tiny bit, and when you start seeing shrubs and trees, you get to the next stage. Okay, on this side, this is always an interesting one where you have glaciers. All right, and here you can see the ice in the glaciers, and as the glaciers retreat and go back, it leaves bare rock exposed. All right, and then you start the process of succession where you have lichens and mosses, which will eventually turn into a forest. Okay, so you can see it actually, if you want to go, I did the shortcut, but if you actually do it, it goes that way. And then you get a few more lichens and mosses, then you get the small grasses and shrubs, which then eventually turn into a young forest, and then eventually into a climax forest. Okay, and those are all examples of succession. So, very important process, one which you need to know. So when you drive home, you should be able to walk around and actually be able to tell how old things are. This picture in front of you is actually something you're very familiar with. This is an old sidewalk or parking lot, I'm not sure which, in which the grasses are starting to grow in it. Okay, this is primary succession. If you leave a parking lot untouched, nature will slowly and surely turn it back into an oak hickory forest here in Pennsylvania. Nature has an amazing ability to take a damaged or altered or new ecosystem and create its true biome. And that process, if we allow it to occur, creates tremendous biodiversity across our entire planet. Finally, succession can also occur in any ecosystem. I just wanted to show you this picture, my final picture. This is a lake or a pond that has undergone succession or is currently in the process of undergoing succession. This is called pond succession. All ponds do this. No pond or lake on this planet is permanent. Every single one is temporary because it goes through succession. And as you can see, the old boundary out this way, where the lake used to be, slowly fills in. Okay, and you can see now the boundary is down in here, and this has all filled in with sediment and stuff from the surrounding land. Okay, and that's what's going to happen. Ponds fill in, and as the ponds fill in, the ponds keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller until they disappear. You will be able to see this in our environmental center. We have a pond currently going through succession.